Let me preface this by saying thank you to the people who developed that creepy smile guy video, or else I wouldn't have found this Reddit to share my encounter. Years ago, when I was in 2nd grade, 22 now, my parents, one Monday morning, finally felt confident in allowing me to come home from school by myself and stay home without a babysitter until they came home. That morning, my father gave me the house key, showed me the emergency numbers in the yellow book, and gave me instructions on what to do if stupid things happened, like the house catching on fire. After school that day, I came home, put the key in the door, and walked into my open house. I felt free, and I felt privileged that I was finally a big boy, and that I could now be home on my own. Needless to say, I kinda got caught up in the moment, and ate tons of ice cream while watching Terminator on VHS, since my parents would never let me watch anything over PG-13. Around 5 that day, I heard the doorbell ring. My dad told me to never answer the door by myself, even if they were home. I walked to our family room, where I could get a good view of who was there. Maybe my dad was getting a package or something. He did always enjoy ordering things online. I saw a middle-aged man standing there in a dark black jacket that I've never seen before. He rang the doorbell again, and I expected him to leave after no one answered. After a 3rd ring, I saw him walk down the steps and assumed he was leaving. I went back to watching Terminator when I noticed something outside my kitchen window. The man was walking in our backyard for some odd reason. I felt scared for my life since some stranger was on my property. I ran under the kitchen table and grabbed the cordless phone from the counter and proceeded to call my dad's work number. My dad answered, and I exclaimed how some strange man was in the backyard and was now proceeding to try and open our sliding door. My dad told me to stay where I was and call the neighbors. He would call 911. I told my dad I loved him, and he said he would call me immediately after he called 911. Before I could call my neighbors, the man was able to somehow open our family room window. I feared for my life and ran to the bathroom and locked the door and called our neighbors. After about 30 seconds, I heard my neighbor running through our house, shouting my name to see if I was okay. She said how she saw no one in the house, and we stayed in the bathroom until the police arrived. The police conducted their investigation and told us they found some fingerprints that matched a recently released convict who was previously put in jail for breaking into homes. After that day, my parents did not leave me without a babysitter until I went to high school. Every week I wonder what happened. Did he run when he saw someone was in the home? Did my neighbor scare him away if he heard her yelling? Needless to say, after that day, and even after I was allowed to stay home without a babysitter, I never stayed home alone. I was either at a friend's house or an after-school program until my parents came home. I still feel unsafe being home alone. During the summer, when I was a kid, I used to stay with my grandma for several days at a time. One week, when I was 12, it was just my grandma and I in our house for 5 days. She owns a small handgun, and the whole family knows she wouldn't be afraid to use it when push comes to shove. One night, we both went to bed earlier than usual at about 11 p.m. I woke up very early. Since there was no clock in the room, I pulled up the blinds and looked out the window, which was right next to me, to see what time of day it was. It was very dark. It was a rural town, so there were no cars, neighbors, or streetlights. So I guessed that it was somewhere between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. A few seconds after I closed the blinds, I heard a deep male voice whisper, "Psst! Hey you!" And I knew that the voice came from outside the window. The room I slept in was on the opposite end of the house as my grandma's room, but since her house is pretty small, she could have heard me and woken up if I yelled. However, I was paralyzed with fear. I was eventually able to convince myself that it did not happen by telling myself, "Oh, you were half asleep. It's probably your imagination," and sat still in my bed for an hour, staring at the door. I was eventually able to fall asleep and had a nightmare of a man running into my room. I immediately woke up. It was then dawn, and I had gathered up enough courage to run to my grandma's room. We looked around the house for a short amount of time, and we judged that the man was long gone. I went back to bed and woke up a few hours later. My mom was talking to my grandma in the living room. ready to take me home because it was my last day. When I walked in the room, my grandma told me that she saw on the news before I woke up again. A convict was being transported to a new prison and had escaped from the transport less than a mile from the house. I never looked into it because I had no intention of finding out what he was convicted of. A couple of months ago, I got an email from my Hmmmm, who lived in Fort McMurray, Alberta formerly. There's been a huge wildfire that destroyed most of the city. He had gotten a call from my great aunt, whom I'd never met, and told me that my birth father wanted to make contact. To explain things better, I was adopted at birth by my parents, who had waited 10 years and had 3 other failed adoptions. I've grown up with a basically normal, happy life. I say basically because my biological family has a history. It's an open adoption, so over the years, I've had arranged visits with my birth mother, my birth grandparents, Kukam and Musum, and recently met my biological aunt and uncle. But my birth father, he's a whole other story. I never met the guy personally, and I honestly don't want to. As the stories go, he was a friend of one of my 3 uncles, and coincidentally, 3 years younger than my birth mother. Both did drugs for a time, and drank excessively. They never really bonded, as the story goes, but he, Curtis, was apparently infatuated with my mother. There are several parts to the story, but I'll focus more on the significant parts, such as my conception. My mother had come back to her hometown after several months away, and a friend threw a party in a local Boston pizza bar. She only drank socially at that time, and my birth father was there. By the end of the night, he had walked her back to her apartment, and, well, he took advantage of her drunken stupor. 3 months later, when she couldn't hold down alcohol, or coffee and marijuana, she took a test and learned she was pregnant with me. My birth father learned this, and he became distant, instantly refusing to take any part in my life. My birth mother had support though, despite her financial situation, and decided to put me up for adoption. I'm so glad she did. The reason for me typing this is, after my birth father requested to see me, I told my parents my Musum's message, and they started freaking out. They told me why, a few minutes later. Apparently when I was 2 years old, my birth father came to our house. We had recently adopted Tiny, an ironically named Newfoundlander, who was gentle, but still protective of our family. When he showed up, Tiny apparently couldn't stop growling. Dad wasn't sure at first who he was, and I was downstairs watching TV, away from sight. My birth father told him, my dad, that he had come to take me with him, and he had gotten a court set up and ready to get the custody rights for me. He reeked of beer and seemed high on something. My dad refused to let him come inside. My mom, downstairs in the laundry room, saw him and immediately rushed over to the den and made me hide in a closet. She didn't want him to find me if he forced his way inside. Meanwhile, my birth father kept insisting to come inside, but my dad threatened to call the police if he tried anything. He wouldn't let him see me until he had an official court document and told him to get off our property. Mom, being a freaking hero, opened the back door for Tiny so she can get onto the porch. Dad says that after Tiny raced over, growling and barking, my birth father ran off into his truck and sped away. He called the police shortly after because he'd seen a holster on my birth father's hip with a gun inside. 2 weeks later, my biological father was arrested for illegal drug possession and distribution, illegal arms dealings related to gangs, and a slew of other charges that landed him in prison for a decade. What's scary though is, inside his truck, they found a gun, duct tape, stuffed animals, and a few photographs of me taken when I was playing outside in the backyard. I was 12 when he was released, but he never tried to see me. He went to see my birth mother though, and asked where I was. When she refused, he threatened her, and she only gave him a photograph of me from our last visit at my 10th birthday. He started to cry, and left her alone after that. I'm pleased to say that he never tried to get into contact with me after I told Hmmmm I wasn't ready, and the message was relayed to him, and I probably won't be for a few more years. He's apparently married and living outside of Canada, or at the least, far from my province. After all, I don't think anyone would really be up for meeting with a guy who tries to stalk you and, in a way, kidnap you.